Don't Think Twice is a podcast on intimate friendship. Amrita and Andrew are writers and creative collaborators, platonic life partners, and parents to a 1-year-old son. Today, a literal expert on intimate friendship. Rhaina Cohen is an author, whom you may also know as a reporter and producer on NPR, and she's released a best-selling new book called The Other Significant Others. It's a beautifully reported book on lives centering friendship at the core. Obviously, we were beyond excited and honored to speak with her.
Rhaina, thank you so much for taking the time.
Really happy to have an excuse to talk to you both. I mean, I had several people send me the Curbed piece, and it's just really nice to talk to kindred spirits.
I absolutely loved reading your book, and obviously so much synergy in what you're writing about, and really excited to get into it. I would love to just have you introduce yourself and maybe tell us, why this book?
So I'm Rhaina Cohen. I'm a journalist, which I think depending on how you want to frame it means I'm a professional curious person or professional nosy person. And I tend to be particularly nosy/curious about how we live our personal lives and the things that we take for granted as normal in our social worlds, and kind of examining them in a different way. And that's kind of what I'm doing in my book. I came to it because I fell into a friendship that to me really challenged everything I thought I knew about friendship and what I had been told. And I then kind of set off to find other people who had a friendship that rose to the level of a partnership, which, had I known, I could have talked to you two. I started working on the book for a personal reason. And then as I went on, realized that these friendships really can act as a mirror for our thinking about which relationships matter, about the kind of hierarchy that we take for granted that you all are very familiar with. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
So the title of the book is The Other Significant Others, but the subtitle is Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Center. And I'd like to take a moment to frame the conversation. Can you speak a little bit to that history, that of friendship, for a moment, and what you found over the course of writing this book?
I found that we are in a moment that's a historical anomaly where most people see friendship as a peripheral relationship, one that is not very defined, that is temporary, that has, basically no rituals around it past age, 10 or 13. And what I saw in the past was that people had extremely intimate and effusive same-sex friendships in particular, and that friendship also could be the most important relationship in a person's life, the place where they felt the most emotional intimacy, rather than this thing that they would maybe fit into their life if they had the space. And one thing I really loved coming across during my research is this book called Picturing Men that has all these photos of ordinary men, a lot of them in studios, who are friends, and you just see how physically close they were up until 1930s or so. But before that, it's like men sitting on each other's laps, posing for these studio portraits. I mean, it was that was kind of the norm at the time, that you could be that close to a friend. I started to kind of wonder, why have we come around to this place where friendship is so insignificant to people, when that has not been true across history? I mean, there have been ceremonies to commemorate friendship. There are friends who have been buried together. This was not happening outside the mainstream. And I was interested in kind of how do we learn a little bit from the past in the present day?
So one thing that also really struck me, just even in your introduction, is that you move really quickly past the idea that maybe we need to find an accepted term that would be a way to convey how deep these relationships are. And I'm curious, why are you less interested in the naming and the vocabulary?
I mean, I will say I'm very interested in the absence of language, and that was one of the things that set me off in the first place, because I knew from my own life, and having found a few people in my personal life who had these sorts of friendships, that it was frustrating to have no term for the most important relationship, that the center of your life. So I did think that a label was important, but as I went on, I started to see, one, that a singular label was probably not going to capture everybody's experiences. So I knew that there'd be some limitations there. And I also wanted to be careful that a label was not the end goal, that I think there's a way that you could stop a conversation by saying, okay, platonic life partner, we've got the term, like I will remember it, add it to my list of new in vogue terms, and then move on, rather than do something that I think is kind of more destabilizing and more provocative, which is really to reflect on my own thinking about friendships, whether or not I want anything like this or ever had anything like this or have currently. What can it tell me about how I think about which relationships are worth pursuing, which should be recognized by the law, and so on. So I think the labeling question is important, and I think we are already at a place where like a term like platonic partner is not completely wild in some corners of society. But I would like us to have that be kind of one step in this process of rethinking friendship, rethinking relationships.
In the book, each chapter centers on a different case study of friends whose relationship somehow transgresses a boundary into a more intimate space, whether, as you said, it's called platonic partnership or something else. Can we talk a minute for how these friendships began? Is there anything that distinguishes the foundations of these relationships and how they grow into something deeper?
I think often the people who fell into these extremely close friendships had proximity to each other at a point where it allowed them to spend a lot of time together. So one of the ideas I came across while working on the book came from a psychologist named Lisa Diamond, who does work on attachment. So when we think about attachment, it's often in terms of parent-child or romantic relationship. But she was saying, like, you can have attachment to a friend too, and that the magic ingredients are time, togetherness, and touch. And, particularly time and togetherness, I saw was a kind of key part of a lot of the beginnings of these friendships. So, another pair that I profiled met through activist work where they had an excuse to rack up a lot of hours. And what ended up happening for a lot of these friends is that kind of the structure of their lives made it so that they could rack up those hours and just do things together. So have the togetherness piece. And then eventually, get to a place where maybe they were committing to each other, or at least were really open to being involved in each other's lives, whether that was essentially inviting themselves on a vacation with the other, or just sort of not being super self-conscious about how increasingly entangled they were becoming in each other's lives.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get back to those other threads of the time, togetherness, and touch. But first, I do want to ask you. You write very candidly in the book about your own relationship. You met your best friend after you were already married, and would you be willing to share a little bit about how those two kind of core relationships in your life coexisted when that friendship was kind of at its most intense?
I often kind of think of the word decadent when I think of that time. Like I had abundance, really. I had I had people beyond my friend who I refer to as M and my husband who I refer to as Marco in the book. They were these sort of core people that I kind of always had more than one person to turn to, and having people in my life with these different strengths and different ways of responding to maybe the same situation often was great for me. And the kind of image that I have on the decadence front is like there was a point where we were all hanging out in my house, my apartment that I shared with my husband, and then we like went on a walk, and then I had the two of them holding my hand on either side, and that was like not a just a one-time occurrence, but I just felt like extraordinarily supported, and that I had a lot of like different sources of joy from the two of them.
So let's dive into a few of these topics via some of the case studies in the book. But on the topic of the touch part, we were speaking about separating intimacy from sex and romance. We have Stacy and Grace, and they begin their relationship thinking of their relationship as sexual, but they end up in a more ambiguous place that is romantic but not sexual. How did the subjects in this book help you come to a more nuanced definition of romance?
I think like a lot of people, I had not sat down and thought about what is romance and just kind of linked it to sex and had some ideas about like candlelit dinners, rom-coms, whatever. I will say also it is such a stimulating topic for conversation to ask people what it means for something to be romantic, because it is not something that's often examined. And what I ended up coming to was one that sex and romance can overlap, but they don't have to. And in fact, I started off the book thinking I was writing about romantic friendship. So when I was talking about history earlier, there is a historical term for very intimate same-sex friendships, which is romantic friendship. And it kind of blurs the categories that we think of as being pretty distinct. And I was interested in that because it really reflected what Em and I have with each other, which is this kind of like thrill to be around each other, and we will celebrate the anniversary when we met, and other kinds of things that I would consider romantic, which, you know, the definition that really resonated the most for me came from Stacy, who talked about how celebrating the relationship like as an entity. So not just, you know, celebrating a person for their birthday, but tending to and celebrating the relationship, that is what romance is. And one of the things that might distinguish romantic relationships from friendships is, do we treat them as entities that we are going to celebrate and honor and tend to? And can we bring some of the things that we've been told are exclusive to romantic relationships to friendship?
So there's the one side where it's sort of separating maybe the sex and romance that don't always have to overlap. But there's also some examples in the book where sex and romance are both absent from a partnership. I'm thinking of there's a pair, Natasha and Linda. They start off as coworkers and then deepen their relationship into eventually becoming co-parents. Obviously of particular interest to us.
Why would that be?
So I wonder, you know, like how does that co-parenting relationship in your book kind of speak to the possibility of partnership that's separate from sex or romance? You know, that adds an extra layer of complexity.
I think it shows that the nature of the relationship between the adults might be less important than the relationship between the adult and the child, as long as the adults have like an amicable, caring, loving relationship, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a sexual or romantic one. And one thing that I found so interesting about going down this rabbit hole was that there are both conservatives and people on the left who have made this argument. There is reasoning on both sides that if you care about the family unit, or you care about raising the kids, and the adults are treating each other well, like that is a very strong basis for parenthood, and that romance, in fact, can be volatile. Lots of people do maintain their romantic relationships, or the romantic essence of their, you know, relationship or marriage with parenting. But I think we get that it is okay for that to go away for some time or even permanently, and for it to still be a positive setting in which to raise a child. So I think that these friends are just showing that you can start in a place where it's platonic, where romance and sex is not the basis for the relationship, but instead it's about shared values and commitment to each other and to raising the child together.
Yeah, it's very striking what you said about there is a place of shared values from the both conservative and liberal side. The end game is having better protections for children, and we just have like a disagreement of how to get there. Is it by promoting marriage, or is it by promoting protections that support that? And I just want to add like that you tell us that 40% of children are now born to unmarried parents.
Yeah, I think the research really bears out that stability is the thing that matters, and it makes sense to be looking at the stability of the family unit for kids rather than looking at the structure or of the relationship between the adults. And that can very well happen in a platonic relationship. I will say, I'm curious, how did it feel for you to read that chapter about these friends who were coworkers and then raised their kids together?
There are people in the world like us.
We were coworkers initially, but we were friends for a long time before we actually decided to have kids together. So it's a little bit of a different trajectory, but it's but you know, it really strikes me about the idea of commitment. That's really what the hallmark of this relationship in the book is, that one coworker just committed to saying, I'm going to show up to every birthing class, and then I'm going to keep showing up to the doctor's appointments, and then I'm going to keep showing up. And it's just about that practice of commitment built up into something that was, they became essential family members to each other. And yeah, for me, it was just the common thread there was really the idea of committing. But something also related, another pair in the book who are queer activists, and you talk a little bit about, for activists and especially for people in the LGBT community, marriage has not actually always been the end game for equality, because it doesn't expand the protections for these other types of relationships. And one thing that was such a revelation for me, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about this Colorado law that's already on the books that kind of provides that disambiguation of the protections that marriage provides versus like, how can we get that outside of marriage or for more relationships. Would you tell us a little bit about what you found out about that law?
Yeah, it's a law that some legal scholars have pointed to as something that could be a kind of template for states to pick up, because it provides the opportunity for the core rights that a lot of people would want to exchange with somebody of their choice, which could be a friend, it could be a sibling or someone else. And those are rights related to healthcare, end of life, and finances. Something that's interesting about how the Colorado law works is that it's not one size fits all. There are 16 rights, and each person can select whether they want to give and receive that right. And this makes a lot of sense if if the relationship is not totally reciprocal. Like in the case of the two women who are these activists, Emily and Joan, they're 20 years apart. So it does not make sense for the younger person to name the friend who's 20 years her senior to kind of handle her end of life care. So it's really helpful for people in a range of relationships. And it's just a 2-page form. It's super simple. It's not expensive. And you could try to get those rights, like contract it out through a will, but you're going to end up paying thousands of dollars, most likely by going to a lawyer to get that kind of specificity. So I think that the way that it is flexible and malleable, but also very accessible is a great combination. And if that existed in states, like people could take that up and they wouldn't have to only have marriage as the option when it just might not make sense for the nature of the relationship or for, ideologically, or like there are 1,000 rights and benefits and obligations on the federal level that are attached to marriage, and not everybody like wants or needs all of that.
So we've touched on some of these topics that we've talked about so far in a couple of episodes of the podcast. Something that I am particularly have been interested in talking about that we haven't really touched on is about gender and about masculinity, particularly. A lot of these conversations leave this out, and there is a pair in your book, Art and Nick, and one is a gay man and one is a straight man. You have another pair, Toli and Andrew, who are two straight men who are partnered. And can you tell us a bit more about how society's expectations around masculinity particularly played into these pairs?
Expectations around masculinity loomed over and continue to loom over both of these relationships. So Art and Nick are, I think, a really interesting case because they met as youth pastors. Nick grew up in this very conservative environment where he was really trained to be homophobic, and yet he like became close to a gay man as a friend, and also Art's roots are in Brazil, so he has different expectations for masculinity, not just as a gay man, but a culture where men are often affectionate with one another. And it took quite a bit for Nick to question what he had taken as truth, and Art develop these questions. If something feels uncomfortable, what is moral, what is cultural, and what is personal? So Art would like rest his arm around Nick, and like Nick would recoil from that. And Nick had to ask himself, why do I not want this? Is it because it is morally wrong? It's like, well, I don't know. There's a lot of like men laying on each other's bosoms in the Bible. Probably fine. Is it culturally a problem? Yeah. I mean, culture is kind of sending that message. On a personal level, does it feel uncomfortable or wrong? And Nick was like, well, I have sort of sensory overloads if someone's like rubbing my shoulder, but if it's just resting there, it's actually kind of nice. And so, that's an example of like what it takes to interrogate something as simple as, do I feel comfortable with somebody resting their arm on my shoulder? And then, multiply that out to many other ways that masculine norms will inform how men interact with each other. I really love Art and Nick's story because of the journey that Nick goes on to rethink what he had internalized as the right kind of behavior. And I'll just say that they have faced consequences for their friendship where they have committed to each other as family. Right now they live together. They will probably live next door to each other in the long term. And then in Tolly and Andrew's case, they're two straight men, as you mentioned, and their friendship is just perplexed so many people, including their parents, including women that they've dated. And I would even say that when I would describe the different people I was writing about in the book, I would get questions from people about like, well, are they really straight? Or like, are you sure? I did not get that when I was talking about straight women. There's even among, more left-leaning, not homophobic people, they still could not wrap their heads around two straight men who were quote unquote just friends and weren't repressing some sexual desire. But I think the people who are close to them, who have seen their friendship up close, have come to understand it and really appreciate it. And that is there's another arc of the book related to them that I think of as very hopeful, that maybe we're not used to this. We're not used to seeing men who are this close, but if you get to kind of see on the inside how it operates, it starts to make more sense. And then we can kind of turn the gaze back at ourselves about like, why do we find this so uncomfortable?
There are a lot of pairs in the book that are queer. And it makes me wonder, would it be more difficult for a straight man and a straight woman to have a non-sexual romantic intimacy?
I will say that I had trouble finding pairs like this. I have found them now, or I've had people reach out to me and tell me about them. I mean, in fact, I ended up in a long conversation with a colleague of mine whose best friend, who she's had for at least 40 years, is a straight man and she's a straight woman. And it makes total sense to her. And what I've heard from the people who have reached out is that they are craving more acceptance of friendships, really deep friendships between men and women. And I am still astonished that we're having like When Harry Met Sally conversation, however many decades after that movie came out. So I do think that there is this hang up that a lot of people have, and that there is even more swimming against the tide that people in that configuration need to have. I think queer people show that this is like, this is not like a fact of existence. Queer women are close friends with other queer women. Queer men are very close with other queer men. There are particular ideas connected to straightness, and that you can't actually be friends with somebody who you kind of in theory could be attracted to. That I think really unfortunately stand in the way and block people off from a huge segment of the population.
Yeah, it's not even just that intimate friendships are taboo between straight men and straight women. It's that like any friendship sometimes, I mean, we're still having that conversation in pop culture. It is mind-blowing. So something that you mentioned earlier and has been such a recurring theme in your book, we have these traditional mile markers for romantic relationships that help us kind of define what they are. It's been called a relationship escalator. Nick in the book calls it, I think, a relationship trellis that he had to dismantle. And, we have a lack of those kind of rituals around how we start a friendship, how we commit to a friendship, how we maybe end a friendship. And I wonder, do you have thoughts about maybe how we bring more ritual to friendships, or how maybe we bring less ritual and formality to romantic partnerships? And what have you seen about how others create these traditions and rituals?
Well, on the point that we were talking about before in terms of what is romance, and that I think one pretty decent definition, is celebrating the relationship or the entity. That's what a lot of the friends that I profiled did. They would celebrate the anniversary of the friendship, or for Nick and Art, they call it their brotherversary, and they would do something special together. Or they also have a weekly ritual that they consider sacred, where they have Friday morning coffee and board games, and they talk for several hours. For other people, there might be an exchange of jewelry. I met somebody recently who, along with these two close friends, they all picked a last name and legally changed their last name to mark each other as family, and then had a gathering of their three families for the summer solstice, which they are planning to do every year now. So, I have seen how people can create really extraordinary, beautiful rituals that are particular to them. It also, is nice to have the scripts so that you don't have to invent everything yourself. And I think it is a way to elevate friendships, to have these rituals involved, because the ritual also is connected to commitment, as we're talking about, is such a big piece. In terms of like, do we need to scale down rituals for romantic relationships? I think that we are honestly like a ritual deprived culture, and that I would never suggest that people reduce rituals. I think what I would hope for romantic relationships is bringing more intentionality, that, along the lines of what Nick was doing, where he was asking, are the things that I feel like I want or don't want, are those what I actually feel, or is that what I have just internalized? I think it's worth people doing that same kind of thinking and interrogating for their relationships. And that's the whole idea of the relationship escalator, that you just sort of get pulled on it like an inexorable force, one direction to go in. And there's sort of a definition of success, like, you date, you become exclusive, you move in together, you get married, you have children. And it doesn't leave much room for people to figure out like what works for them in particular. And I think these friends can be great models of what it looks like to be intentional. And you can bring that into a romantic relationship. For these friends, they have no script, so they have to be intentional. As I know very much is the case for the two of you, and the way that you've set up your home and you've set up, your parenting. And one example that I think of that probably is useful for romantic partners is what Linda and Natasha came to. So these are the two women who are parents and to the same child. And Linda sold her house, moved into the same condo building as Natasha, bought a unit in it, and they are vertical neighbors. And if they were romantic partners, they probably would have felt compelled to live together, but they kind of knew that they probably wouldn't live well together, and they're able to have something that works totally for them. So I think I would want romantic partners to be able to bring more curiosity and creativity and intentionality, and for friends to be able to get the benefits of ritual, and then also outside recognition for the significance of their relationship.
I love the reciprocal nature of that it's not just that we need to scale back on one and amp up the other, but it's that both types of relationships have something to sort of borrow from each other. And especially that like intentionality of not defaulting into the next step on the escalator.
Yeah. I mean, this is, to me, the whole like mission of the book is to have people be less attached to defaults. In that, you can make that as broad as you want. I'm specifically digging in on our relationships. And the other thing I want to say is that I never wanted to write a book that was like down with romantic relationships, like down with marriage. I think that we're operating on extremes, where we're told a romantic partner is supposed to be your everything, and it's supposed to be the number one relationship and supersedes everything else. And that friendship is nice to have, not a need to have, is kind of superfluous. And I don't think that those extremes are working for either kind of relationship, and that both can learn from each other. And also, different people are different. Like, some people are going to configure their lives in a way that looks conventional and they're going to love it. And others, that would not work for them, and they want this totally different thing. So I'm a pluralist, and like I try to convey that in the book.
in thinking about, the ways that in the romantic relationships we're allowed and encouraged to fall madly, deeply in love with someone, and to be heartbroken and shattered when relationships end, we aren't afforded the same levels of emotion when it comes to friendship. And in thinking about and writing about your own friendship with M, you spoke beautifully about something you call disenfranchised grief. Can you explain that term a little bit and why it's important to the idea of friendship?
So disenfranchised grief comes from a grief expert named Kenneth Doka, and he found that for some people, some kinds of relationships, that the grief that those people felt was not condoned, wasn't recognized by others. And this is really salient in the context of friendship, because if friendships at their height are not recognized as important, then the loss of them is not going to be understood or recognized either. Instead, what it ends up being is this experience of grief that has an additional unnecessary layer of people not understanding, not supporting, maybe diminishing the experience. Like one woman I spoke to, whose dear friend, who she would, had the nickname of wife for, when that friend died by suicide, she was talking to somebody who was like, "Oh yeah, like somebody I know from high school died." Like there was, as if that was equivalent. So I just think we are making a really hard experience for people of loss even harder, and unnecessarily so.
Yeah, I even have to catch myself on this frequently as using the term just friends. And that's part of like this very casual denigration of that relationship that makes it easier to say when that type of relationship dissolves or tragically ends, that just friends is just such a dismissive way of language that we just don't really think about.
I will say that the original title of the book was More Than Friends. So I really had wanted to riff on this, the way that we think of romantic relationships as more, and friendship as just.
And it's not just sort of the end of relationships, but also just every step along the way. So we've talked a little about the commitment in relationships, but one thing that we don't really talk about either is conflict in relationships, and how wrenching that can be, and how do we handle those things. And one thing that I noticed in the book, you put this principle into practice when you have a co-living situation right now, and you live with a couple that are housemates of yours. And you mentioned that you had a lot of discussion ahead of time. What would happen if we decided this relationship doesn't work anymore? What would we do about it? What might cause it to fracture? Do you think that's been something that's key to the success of your current living situation?
In terms of what that my household has done, so like, yeah, I guess to step back, for 3 years I lived with my husband, two of our close friends, and their two kids. They actually moved to New York about a month ago, and we now have another close friend who is actually mentioned in the book, interestingly, who is living with us, and we're trying to like test out, do we want to live together long term? And in both cases, we've done what is called a pre-mortem, and this is an idea that came from the behavioral scientist Daniel Kahneman, and it's the opposite of a postmortem. So in a postmortem, you like see after everything has happened what went wrong and kind of deconstruct it. Like instead, what we're doing with a pre-mortem is on the front end trying to imagine if things went wrong, why would they? And that can give you the opportunity to pinpoint where things might break down and potentially avoid that. So I think that it was really useful to both practically and emotionally to give each other a sense of what was the kind of life in our household that we were looking forward to, what were the things that we needed to be able to feel like we were at ease in the house, and so that's helpful, so that we kind of knew how to behave. And then I think on an emotional level, it was really valuable to articulate our fears to each other, and to essentially like stare down the worst case scenario and do that together as opposed to in private. And I recently ended up talking to this woman who along with her husband, bought a home with another couple who they're close friends with, and those friends have a kid or two kids, and their real estate agent told them, like, this is a bad idea. You should not buy a house together. But if you insist on doing it, what you all should do is like get a bowl and some paper and write down all the things you're worried about and like put each one of those fears into the bowl and then like sit together and, have it be anonymous, sit together and then pull them out and talk about it. And they did that and they cried. And, I think one of the pieces of paper was like fear that what if like one of the couples got divorced? And so I think there seems to be some kind of insight there about coming together to face those possibilities.
That it really resonates. First of all, that real estate agent must have been like a low-key therapist. It's like a very intense thing for a real estate agent to suggest.
He was a friend of theirs, I think, from their church. So there was some background. It wasn't like some stranger, but yeah, I think that was. I mean, he helped them buy the home.
No, I mean it's a great exercise. That just really resonates a lot for me personally, because Andrew and I had to go through something very similar, putting together a co-parenting agreement for ourselves, which we kind of jokingly said it was like a prenup without the nuptial part of it.
I saw you did that with the Chosen Family Law Center, and I've talked to Diana Adams, who is the head of it, and I was totally amazed by what they described the process is. I was really, just intrigued that there was that legal support, which is very new. Knowing that you worked with the Chosen Family Law Center, it makes sense that it felt like more than a contract.
Yeah, no, and it was when we first got that question, what would cause this relationship to dissolve? My first instinct was to be like, nothing. Nothing at all. No, I can't think of one thing. And Andrew said, was actually the one to take a beat and say, I think you need to challenge yourself to get a little bit more uncomfortable with that question. And that ended up being like a really, really, I think, revealing and interesting part of the process that I personally was very resistant to.
Did you find what I was describing was true on the kind of practical and emotional benefits, or were there other different things that came up from having that conversation?
I think you said like basically staring down the worst case scenario and being unafraid to do that. We've had a pretty smooth year, but that's the nature of family, is that it would be weird if there weren't conflicts to work through, and being forced to confront something that's a little uncomfortable. It felt like an increase in intimacy to me in this relationship.
Yeah. But what you're saying here really makes me also think about something we've touched on a couple times about in other conversations about change. And when you were talking, I really was thinking about change inside romantic relationships and change with friendships, and how when we're in romantic relationships, we're taught to think of ourselves as a partner who we will change together, and when there is conflict, we will fight to maintain the partnership at all costs. When change happens in a friendship, do we fight the same way? Oftentimes just means the end of a friendship. But it's just an observation and thinking of how we get comfortable with knowing that a relationship can't stay the same and that it will change, and that we commit to that change when we're in a romantic relationship, and we maybe don't commit to that change when we're just friends.
The thing that is coming to mind is the different points where we've talked about a friendship as a unit and treating it as a unit, and that it's one of the things that makes the kinds of friendships that I wrote about and the kind of friendship that you two have distinct. That people are not kind of these free-floating individuals, and they think about the friendship. They think about how much time are we spending together, working through conflict and sharing responsibilities. And it's not to say that every friendship needs to be like that and needs to be that intentional, but it seems like it could open up more possibilities for people if they understood that it is possible to treat a friendship as a unit that requires work to preserve, or else it might just dissolve. Whereas in other relationships, we get that there are some things you have to give to, or there are going to be some difficulties along the way, but then you don't just kind of part ways.
Yeah, it made what you said just made me think that sometimes we often say like relationships are work. When we're talking about romantic relationships, you never hear someone say that about a friendship, that friendships require work and it's not always easy.
Yeah, I mean, Nick had said that he grew up being told that if you're thinking about a friendship, you're trying too hard, like that was the ethos, you know. And I think for a lot of people that's how they see it. And then at the same time, we have a society that in which so many people feel lonely and so many people feel disconnected, and like connection comes at a cost. It's time, it's giving to each other, and you know, we have to figure out what's worth it, and being endlessly free, and not having that commitment is gives us some things and then takes away from others.
Absolutely. There's a lot in this book, and we've touched on a bit of it. Is there anything you would like to add that you think we've glossed over, we've skipped entirely?
Yeah, I guess the maybe to this last point, you know, but if the defaults are the one thing I'm pushing against, I think the other uh, big idea that I'm very interested in, both within friendships but in the broader world, is thinking in terms of trade-offs, and that I think people are so inclined to obsess over and overemphasize all of the downsides of something that's unusual, which maybe you can personally, you know, point to and know well, and that people underemphasize the difficulties of the conventional choice. And you know, it's not to say that nobody should be living in a nuclear family household in the suburbs, but I think it's important for us to understand when we are making consequential decisions, like how we set up our lives, how we set up our homes, that you are going to gain things and lose things, no matter what the arrangement is. And what do you want to optimize for, basically? Like what and what costs are you willing to bear? And I see a lot of people coming to a place of realizing that the thing that they were told to want comes with costs that are really not that desirable, that the isolation, the lack of support, particularly for people who have kids, is not the life that they want to have, and that they would rather trade privacy and some control for the social connection, the social support of orienting their lives around friends. I would be really pleased if like people could think about the trade-offs of whatever decision it is that they're making, and that nothing is going to be cost-free.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great place to end, wanting people to examine the choices that they're making, and also just like visibility of making different choices, knowing that there's a different option out there might change the choice that you might make, or it might not change the choice that you might make, but it might help make that decision more informed and more intentional. And so to that end, I'm really grateful to you for talking to us and having this conversation with us, trying to make some of these stories, you know, as widely told as possible and visible. And I think it's a beautiful book, but it's also really important work. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for also making this kind of relationship visible to people. I think people want models. It's really hard to do something that you don't have anyone to talk to. Like I really think it's hugely important to have these examples out there, both for people who might want these friendships, and then, as I said, like the mirror for the rest of us.
The Other Significant Other: Reimagining Life with Friendship at the Center. This is the full name of the book. Thank you, Rhaina.
Thanks for having me talk to you both.
The best way to keep up with us is via our weekly newsletter, Emergency Contacts. Sign up via our website, vjandstevens.com, or at emergencycontacts.substack.com. Rhaina's book is The Other Significant Others. Go read it immediately. The rest of our season will feature amazing guests that help us explore friendship and community building. Next time, group living. What do those words conjure? We'll be getting into it with the author of a new memoir and our dear friend Lola Milholland on communal living.